Good afternoon in the conference time zone, Tux Theatre. Next up, we have PaulGardner-Stephen to talk about digital sovereignty, which is an excellent follow-up from our last talk here in Tux Theatre. So, Paul has been writing open source software since the late 1990s and is best known for the servo mesh off-grid communication systems, the 64-net system for connecting Commodore 64 computers to more boring computers, making and using a working shoe phone, the Mega 65 retro computer, and most recently making a Commodore 64 compatible smartphone, the Megaphone. Welcome, Paul.
Thank you, and thank you for everyone who's tuning in, and I hope you have a good afternoon and had a great conference so far. So, today I really want to talk about digital sovereignty, which, it kind of follows on from what Dawn has been saying, and I think this is really touching on a bunch of themes that many of us have kind of been aware of in a lot of ways, but I think is actually becoming increasingly important, and 2020 has kind of reminded us of the importance of this. So, just a quick bit of outline. The first bit, my apologies, is a little bit depressing because we kind of talk about the context that we find ourselves in these times and how that's kind of degraded from what it might have been 20, 30 years ago in terms of freedoms and various things. And that then kind of leads into this idea of the coming digital winter that I'll explain a little bit more. And then I really want to talk about what our role in the open source and open hardware community is to, if we can, actually potentially even prevent a digital winter from ever occurring, but if it must occur, to make it as short and as shallow as possible, and for it to be delayed as long as we can, and then to look forward to the next coming digital spring as we come out the other side of that. So if we look at the world at the moment, I think it's quite apparent to us that the Pax Americana is really starting to fall apart in quite a significant way, that the undisputed hegemony of the United States following World War II, and particularly following the end of the Cold War, has come to an end. Russia is back as a superpower, and now China is stepping back up, again also to be a superpower, because of course China was the superpower for the longest time in history. If we go back into to the Dark Ages in Europe and going back from there. And so we don't have the stability that a single hegemony brings, for better or for worse, whoever's in charge, right? It doesn't matter who the hegemon is, that it tends to lead to a kind of stability because they're kind of saying, okay, this is how it is. It's not being contested. It's not being disputed in any significant way on the geopolitical scene. But we've seen that that's no longer the case. China is flexing its muscles. Russia is doing so again as well. And this has led to a world that has become unsettled. And in fact, we're back into a new Cold War. We feel this particularly here in Australia, that China and Australian relations have come to a bit of a low at the moment over a variety of things, and I think that really has reached Cold War kind of levels. Hopefully we can actually back out of that. I think we have a good chance. And of course, Russia, China, and the United States are all sparring against each other in different ways. And COVID-19 has amplified a lot of the existing problems that were already in the world. There's the poverty and inequality, and people living in really untenable and undignified conditions are now made even more vulnerable by this. And the hollowing out of the middle class over the last 20 years has also really been further driven with COVID, where those who have secure employment versus those who don't are affected in very different ways. And the risk is that people lose hope in the current system and start looking for other people to come, for a political savior to turn their prospects around. And we saw in the United States in the past 4 years exactly this coming out, the hollowing out of middle class, blue collar America and manufacturing and all of those sorts of things was a direct leading factor into the Trump phenomenon. He was able to use that large group of disenfranchised people and promise them better jobs, better prospects. And that's why a lot of his emphasis was on, stopping companies taking their product manufacture out of the United States, because it was exactly this group of disenfranchised people who had become hopeless who were drawn to him. Not necessarily because they thought that he was, an honest and trustworthy man, But they will have thought to themselves, well, we've tried the alternatives for the past 20, 30, 40 years, and none of that worked. Maybe this will. And that's a very dangerous place for a society to reach, because it leads to these charismatic leaders who are perceived as strong by these people who think that they might be a champion for their need. And again, in recent history, we actually see that this is what's led to Putin in Russia. And Putin has effectively captured the Russian democratic system. And we saw almost the same kind of thing happening with Trump in the United States. China is a little bit different in that there's a bunch of cultural differences that lead, and history that's led to a different kind of approach. But we still see again that their willingness to embrace who they see as a strong leader to undo the shame that China suffered at the hands of colonial powers, over the last 150 years. There's this really common thread in all of this. And so this is this junction we find ourselves in the world, that all three global superpowers are leading away from democracy to whatever extent they had it to begin with, and towards autocratic, dictatorial, dominance by these kind of strong leader types as they're viewed. And this then leads to the kind of expected results from that truth and the freedom of the press are victims. The interesting twist we've actually seen in the United States under Trump was not that the freedom of the press itself was actually greatly diminished, but that with social media and all of these kind of tools, that it's really quite possible to make these kind of echo chamber bubbles in which people just won't look at alternative views. And so they get reinforced. They believe the lies that they're being told by the propagandists because they're actually ignoring the sources that would tell them otherwise. Whereas in the past, you couldn't filter out, the opinions to have only the ones that you agreed with to such the extent that's now possible. But whatever the particular dynamics, there are parallels, it seems to me at least, in the lead up to World War II of this disenfranchisement that Germany under the Treaty of Versailles was greatly impoverished. That they were looking for hope, for freedom from that hopelessness in which they had found themselves. They didn't want to think about how to mine gold out of seawater anymore. They wanted to just get on with life and enjoy prosperous and relatively free lives, as we all do. This is a very natural human response. And so the loss of prosperity over the last 20 years and the loss of hope for many people is dangerous in making people want these kind of things. So freedom of the press is vital for a healthy democracy. This is frequently said, but I would actually argue that it's not sufficient to safeguard democracy. In the past, it might have been, but certainly now, again, we talked about these echo chambers and things, that this is no longer the case. That this echo chamber effect can really result in extreme polarization and segmentation within a country, very much us and them mentality, in a way that just in the past wasn't possible to do, because you still had to kind of engage with your neighbors, and you'd read newspapers that would have a variety of opinions because it was the one outlet, and you already had the thing there, and you're eating your egg and bacon for breakfast, and you've read the articles that you really like, and you still kind of then would go on and read or at least see information that you disagreed with. And so the loss of that is actually really quite dangerous. And so now, we have freedom of the press, but anything that you don't agree with gets labelled fake news. And, in the United States, both sides were guilty of that to varying degrees. That, if you listen to any one news outlet, you would get a very stilted view of everything. So, as we said, all of this means that liberal democracy is now at risk. So that the echo chamber effect in the United States led to, a coup d'etat in the United States. This is, it was previously almost unthinkable. But again, you look back at, in the past, it's similar kind of things, and we see these kind of parallels. There's the Reichstag fire that was used to seize emergency powers in Germany in the lead up to World War II was not very dissimilar to the calls in the United States for the use of emergency powers in the military to run fair elections. Fortunately, the United States and the world has escaped that on this occasion. But the fact that it came that close should be a wake-up call to us. That these things are, democracy is actually a fragile beast and needs to be cared for, and we need to think about how changing technology, changing circumstances changes the defenses that we need to create for democracy. Because if we don't, my fear is that the democratic systems that we enjoy, that protect our freedoms to the maximum extent that we seem to be able to muster out of a political system. It's not perfect by any stretch, but it's less bad than any other. That now that a whole country can be driven and polarized in the way that we saw in the United States in the past 4 years, I'm not sure that democracy can survive those kind of assaults, indefinitely. Hopefully, we look forward to 4 years of relief from that in the United States. Whether or not you like the policies of the two parties is a separate issue from whether a group of people are going to try and strengthen the democratic processes. So, how do we protect this going forward? Because one of the other really key things that history shows us is actually that the post-World War II prosperity and freedom enjoyed in many places around the world, not in all of them by any stretch, but that there was such widespread personal freedom and prosperity that's led to many good things, is an aberration in history. When you look at the Dark Ages and you had feudal systems, you look at the Roman system and you had these massive underclasses of slaves and servants and things. And so, it is an aberration in history that we had a long period of relative peace, prosperity and freedom. It will not continue if we take it for granted. We have to nurture it. We have to let it grow. We have to heal its wounds when it gets wounds. And we have to do what we can to prevent what will happen if it fails and to deal with that contingency. Because if we don't have contingencies for that, it's much easier, in fact, for these things to happen. That, countries have a military force in the best sense, actually not to attack other militaries, but actually to prevent other militaries from wanting to attack them. The Swiss stayed neutral in World War II, not because they said we are neutral. They stayed neutral because Hitler couldn't find a way to invade Switzerland. It was just too much work because Switzerland had itself, it was armed neutrality. It wasn't defenseless neutrality. Because defenseless neutrality doesn't survive in the modern world as much as that may grieve, perhaps all of us, in fact. It certainly grieves me that it seems to not be possible. So where we are at the moment, I would say that we're in this kind of what I would call a digital autumn. The digital summer is behind us, where we could start to create these things. Because actually the interesting thing is that in the summer, the early summer, there's actually not much fruit. Things are growing, but you're not harvesting very much. But the hope, the excitement is there, and we work hard. And so I would say, the 70s through to, turn of the century or soon after was the digital summer. And of course, when the summer ends and the autumn starts, this is a little bit hard to tell and varies based on weather, not just on climate. But I would say that we are now firmly in the digital winter where the digital autumn. There's lots of digital fruit on the trees, if you like. There's all of these things that we've been able to create, and it's now really easy to kind of, pick the fruit and make a tasty tart. We can make things out of them. And that's really great. And we can get our fill from that really easily. And this is wonderful. The autumn is I love this time of year in Australia as well. Even in the summer, we have the stone fruit and everything come in. And then later in early autumn, we get some of the other kind of fruit coming in. And the days are lovely and warm still. The days are still long enough. The autumn is a lovely time. But the winter will come. And when the winter comes, then we stop. There's no more fruit on the tree. This is kind of, the definition of winter. You save during the summer and the autumn so that you have something to eat during the winter. And so from a technological and freedom perspective, we have to be saving away the things that will let us, preserve the benefits and to keep us healthy and alive when there's nothing new can be created, when censorship prevents us from being able to innovate freely, from making sovereign technologies where we as the users are in control. Because this is really what digital sovereignty refers to, is the ability for us to make technologies that are servant to us, not to someone else. And so we see in China already that the heavy censorship that's going on means that the Chinese people are not free to innovate, to make means of free unfettered communications amongst people there. But we may actually see much worse effects. We may actually see things like the collapse of supply chains, or at least their subjugation and control, so that it's no longer possible to actually make digitally sovereign hardware. At the moment you can get any PCB you like made, and it's probably not going to be backdoored in manufacture. That may change, or you may have to, to make a new, piece of digital equipment, it may have to be approved by, a large company or a government agency or something. There's a variety of kind of dystopian outcomes that are not entirely unrealistic as we kind of look at what's already happening. And so, in this, we fear that Richard Stallman's kind of, dystopia of control of digital systems will have come to pass. That, the ability for people to, to have freedom in this will have evaporated. It will have fallen from the trees as the fruit has. And so all digital systems in a digital winter, or very nearly all of them, all the ones that matter, will be controlled by some kind of dominating powers. Now, whether that's a corporate capture of state, or whether it's actually political capture by dictatorships or the like, in all cases, the freedom of innovation will have curtailed, and digital, the dictatorial states or dominating powers will be able to monitor all communications among citizens. Look at what we do with our mobile phones for communications. This is the main source. If that were being, if encryption were no longer possible, and if there were folks monitoring all communication in your social network graph and all of these things in a greater way and in a more malevolent way than actually already happens today, it's going to be really hard for society to escape from that kind of dictatorship, because you won't even have the tools to communicate with one another. And all of the AI and all of the algorithms that can already predict with uncanny accuracy political dispositions and all of those sorts of things, just the fact that you're not using them and not being just a mere consumer of these technologies in the way that they want, will actually flag you as a potential dissent. So yeah, it's, as I said, the beginning part of this talk is a little bit depressing in that we're talking about these things, but it's not without hope. In fact, quite the contrary. I am optimistic that we can, in the very least, greatly delay a digital winter from coming, and that we may even be able to avoid it completely. And then, even if we can't avoid it, we can certainly make it less severe. And to do that to its maximum extent, we need to be creating now self-sovereign digital systems that are able to be under the complete control of their creators and their users, rather than the creators, or in the role of a user, I should say, because a user may create something for themselves, and that's good and fine. But when they're using it, they have to be in full control, and if someone else is using it, that other person needs to be in full control. Because this will enable us to keep tyrannies accountable and prevent them even from actually emerging in many cases. What's interesting in this is that we actually have to assume that these dominating powers will actually be the primary adversary for the continued availability of these kinds of systems. So it means that the systems that are created, if we want them to survive into a digital winter, have to be simple enough for a single developer to actually maintain the security of in a really proactive and reliable kind of manner. And the commercial sector is not going to fill this role. The incentives for them are not there to do this. In fact, to make more complicated software that is feature-rich rather than secure, we've known for decades that this is how, this is what makes the most commercial sense for companies. And so, it doesn't fall to the commercial sector. It falls to the open source community, as in the past, creating free operating systems and things has to create considerable social benefit and improved human condition. So we need to be creating simple, secure, survivable and sustainable systems if we want them to work into a digital winter. It has to be simple enough to actually be maintainable by a single person, ideally, because in the worst case, you may have to maintain your systems yourself while you're trying to communicate with other like-minded people. Not to undermine government, but rather to actually to continue to support the freedoms that we have and enjoy. And a government that's held to account is always a government that will govern the most responsibly. So we're all about strengthening government. Strengthening not just that we have a government, but actually that the way that they behave is actually as strong in the true sense of actually being a robust and sensible government. So it needs to be simple enough that we can actually maintain. And if an attacker gets in, this will inevitably happen. You need to be able to kick them back out again. And we have to assume that security vulnerabilities will be actively sought out and weaponized to undermine and to monitor dissent. Because that's what, we see this in other places. I mean, even like in Russia at the moment with the protests around the imprisonment of the anti-corruption guy, that phone and internet are kind of popping out again in places in Russia, because again, this is a really effective way to try and control people. And the other thing that we see, of course, in this, and I think Dawn's talk touched on this as well, is that we actually just can't trust modern machines. And I've spoken about this in previous talks. So on media.ccc.de, the Chaos Computer Club site, you'll find a couple of talks by myself there on this topic, and also in the LCA archives as well. And just the mere existence that we have things like the Intel management engine actually means that you just can't trust these machines, because they have a way for things to get in and to persist and to hide from you as the user of the computer that you are not able to touch or to deal with. And in saying that, I'm really glad that there are initiatives to try and nobble the management engine and those sorts of things. I don't want to discourage those in any way, shape or form, but I think it would be foolish to have that as our only approach to ensure that we can continue to have the means of communications and computation should a digital winter come, and indeed to discourage people from attempting to actually bring into force a digital winter by making it much less feasible to do. So in this space, myself and people that I work with have kind of been working on a bunch of things in this space. The Mega 65 retro computer that I spoke about yesterday is partly just because it's really fun, and it's kind of historically of interest. But for me as a humanitarian and social innovator, the fact that it is a computer that has no 32-bit CPU or anything like that in there that can be subverted, if you don't connect the JTAG debug interface, you can't subvert the machine. And that's actually really important to me. And that it's simple enough that you can make software that can do use, that can be maintained, or that you can at least find out how people are, subverting it. And of course, you can easily revert the system back to its original state as well. And so this is quite significant, and it's still useful enough. So I think that last talk that I gave at LCA in 2019, I actually delivered using an earlier prototype of the Mega 65. We made our own slide software for it. It's quite funny if you go back and watch it. And then we have the Megaphone as another one of these initiatives, which is really kind of the Mega 65 with cellular and other radio communications channels built in, but in a really sandboxed way. And again, encourage you to have a look at the talks, particularly the ones on media.ccc.de, if that's of interest to you, how we have gone about making that so that, instead of having a secure enclave and trying to make a trustable computer around that, we actually have a secure, simple computer. The computer is the enclave, and we have these exclaves that are actually the communications things that we don't trust. And we don't let the cellular modem on the same bus, and we can depower it and physically remove it, and all of these sorts of things. So that's designed to provide secure mobile communications and a little bit of compute. And then, of course, we have the serval mesh, peer-to-peer, ad hoc wireless communication system. Marrying that with the Megaphone actually lets us create a fully sovereign communication system that is fully distributed Again, using the UHF radio bays or other radio types in there, or infrared linked point-to-point links, it creates the way for communications to continue in a fully off-grid manner, even if all infrastructure is disabled, monitored, or otherwise. So, I mean, these things were kind of, my thinking initially started in, disaster mitigation. And really, actually, this is, what we're still working on is mitigating natural disasters and disasters caused by the capture or failure of governments to protect the constitutional rights and expectations that we have in our various countries. That's some of the things that we're doing. And the Mega 65 stuff is designed to be very simple. We've written dialers in BASIC in a few weeks, as an example. This is much more maintainable than, for example, an Android distribution or even a Linux phone distribution where you've got millions and billions of lines of code. So more generally, then, what do we see the role of the open community being in these days of the digital autumn? And I would say, above all else, we should actually just use those days wisely and create the tools, think about where the gaps are that can help to protect these things and help to ensure that people have freedom of communications, freedom of innovation going forward. I think one thing that perhaps we haven't, because I think what I've just talked about, actually, we already do quite well as a community in many ways. But I think we perhaps need to value simplicity and graceful degradation more than might naturally come to mind. I'm not saying that we're not doing it. I think we're already doing this in all sorts of things, but we need to have a really conscious thought process about it, saying, okay, what can I make in this that can work when there is no internet? What can I make that is a really simple subset of this that can actually be much more, robustly trusted from security? Because we know that the bugs will come in, and it would vary depending on what you're making as to what form and to what extent that's possible. But I would also say, as we try and make these things, because we're making them to make simple systems rather than complex systems, you do have to lose some functionality sometimes, or some automation of actions in there. And if we're making simpler computers with simpler CPUs, then some things might take a little bit longer to happen as well. But it's quite fun to create them, and actually it's often quite fun to use them, and you kind of often rediscover things from the past as well that were fun back then that we kind of forgot. The simple joy of playing solitaire that many of us haven't forgotten either. On the Mega 65, when that was implemented, it was just like, you don't need to necessarily always have crazy complicated games, massive multiplayer online games to have a bit of fun. Doesn't mean that we won't try and make a massive multiplayer online game for the Mega 65 as well. We'll have to think about how we do that in a system that's that simple. But again, this is kind of the fun of that, and the challenge of working within constraints is actually very real as well. But overall, I actually want us to be optimistic and hopeful. I started with the depressing bit because I wanted to get that out the way. Because as an open source, the open source community and open hardware community, what we have achieved collectively in the past, 50 odd years is simply incredible. Imagine if we took Linux off the scene, we would have Windows as a proprietary system, OS X as another proprietary system. It would be much easier for those operating systems to have locked out unauthorized developers from making things. Instead, because there are alternatives that are less locked down, and that they've had to actually be more tolerant of third-party developers and that kind of thing. And so we've already achieved great victories in ensuring the freedom to innovate, the freedom to communicate, the freedom to use computers as our servants rather than as the servants of large vested interests. There's more to be done, absolutely, but we've already achieved a great deal. So be optimistic, be hopeful. We can and are making a difference. And encourage and support one another. Again, as a community, I think we already do this to a large degree, but I just encourage us to think again more about how we can do that more and say, hey, do you reckon that we could implement such and such in a really simple way that is, fully distributed and, and can stand up to these kind of attacks. Can we reduce the size of this and the complexity while still maintaining the vast majority of the benefit of that? We actually had a coding challenge that one of the supporters of the Mega 65 has been running. It's still open, so if anyone wants a really fun and slightly addictive challenge, the challenge is to draw a very simple pattern on a Commodore 64 to run in the Commodore 64 emulator. You don't need any hardware, in as few bytes as possible. And the first kind of attempts were sort of around a couple of hundred bytes. So it's drawing a spiral that kind of goes in around the screen. I think the smallest it is now is like 52 bytes. It's crazy, but it's just it's highly addictive to kind of go through. Oh, now, can I save another byte somewhere? And while we don't necessarily have to do that level of insane optimization, thinking about, well, in a word processor, what's actually the 90% we need, or in slide software, what's the 90% that we need? And so this can be a really fun kind of process to be in, and we can encourage one another to think about how we can make the things that we're making more resilient in the face of digital winter conditions. So before we go to questions, I really just want to finish with a little excerpt out of one of my favourite German songs, Silbermond. Silver Moon is the English translation of the band name, and it had this song called Time for Optimists. And it's really, they wrote it in the last couple of years. And so it's just reflecting on seeing the challenges in the world around us, but actually not giving into it, actually saying, this is actually a time where optimism, hope, and moving forward is actually most needed, because we feel the need for it the most. And so they sing, so every day is something new to depress, but I doubt I'm the only one who feels that they're going to bust. It feels like everything is pointless and the world seems terribly unjust. But it's a time for optimists, high time for optimists. It's time for optimists. And on that, I'd love to hear any questions that people have, to hear the optimism that we as a community have, and as we wrestle with these kind of issues and how to make the world a better place. So thank you. Oh, I think you're muted.
Thank you, Paul. I still have the wrong headphones on, and I'm...
No, you're fine now. Sorry, just at the beginning you were, I think. So I can hear you fine now.
There we go. Now I'm on track. Thank you, Paul, for that terrifying, but trying to not be too terrifying talk. We do have a question coming in already. So the question is, how do we grow communities that are interested in digital resilience, but are also inclusive of the perspectives and needs of people who aren't computing/electronics nerds, and or those who aren't as intensely worried about privacy?
Wow. Okay. So this is one of the age-old challenges that we face. Effectively, the question is, how do we get people to care more about what we see of of everything that's going on with technology and the capture by vested interests and all of these sorts of things. I think one of the things that we can really usefully do at the moment is actually talk to people about what's happened when 2020 comes up, right? And people talk about the attempted coup in the United States and all these sorts of things. Interestingly, also whether they're for or against it is actually secondary in this. But in both cases, they actually see that the resilience of systems is actually not as great as we thought. America almost fell to a coup. And so I think that can be a really helpful point. I think just reminding people whenever you get creepy ads and stuff on things, going, you know why that's coming up? And just remind them kind of the whole sort of boiling frog thing. It's an ongoing challenge that we have to make people aware of these things. I think in the technology community, to get people thinking more about resilient systems is a little bit easier. Again, you have to kind of sell people the vision. One of the things that's actually been quite interesting with the Mega 65 is that we've sold that vision actually partly because it's really, really fun. We've targeted the Commodore 64 community who still exist and make games and crazy things that seem impossible on an 8-bit machine with 64 kilobytes. And so for them, part of the joy is actually making these things. And so even when we made the slide software that we used a couple of years ago to give the presentation, it was so much fun for everyone involved, and it was hopefully for folks that were watching, to see something that just seemed utterly absurd and impossible to achieve. So I think, yes, find the opportunities to talk about the things, the things that we see out in society around us that need to be undermined. I think, like some of the power grabs that we see government doing when we're not watching, like Peter Dutton trying to get all the powers in the world for ASIO. I think there are many more people who, if they think about those things, actually go, hang on, this isn't right. And so it's, just finding those points where it makes sense to people and they can comprehend the need, because we can't expect people just to understand the technical issues from the outset. I think you're muted again, or at least I can't hear you.
I'm on mute. Just going through the online conference bingo. Yeah. Now I've probably filled a row on people's bingo cards already. The question is, have you heard the term symbiocene? And I hope I pronounced that correctly.
No, I haven't. If someone would like to tell me what it is.
We'll move on to the next question, and maybe something will come in from the chat explaining that later. The next question is, megaphone is a terrible search term. Have you considered something more unique like Mega 65 phones for SEO reasons? Otherwise, I just get a lot of portable PA systems.
God, indeed. We would love to have someone come up with an even better name than just Mega 65 phone for us. Come join our marketing team. And join in the fun.
Yep, I think that's a call for contributors question there. We've got another question. How do we encourage people to take an interest in these issues without scaring them and/or prevent them from taking measures to protect their privacy because it is too difficult?
Yeah, I'm not sure that we actually can rouse a large fraction of society to these issues without scaring them to some degree. But I think one of the great strengths that we have in the open source community is that we have a history of seeing where the thing is that we're concerned about, but actually not peddling fear, but actually peddling hope for a better way. And so we don't just throw hands in the air and go, oh, privacy is terrible on Google search, for example. We're equipped to say, hey, have a look at DuckDuckGo. It does the same as your favorite search engine that is not privacy respecting, but you won't get creepy ads. And so I think that is kind of the best way, is actually to show people what the better way is, and talk about that better space that it brings us into, rather than focusing on the fear mongering, because fear it's rarely a good motivator. Again, we look at when these charismatic despots come about, it's actually because they're successful in peddling fear, and peddling that there is an us and a them in there. So be positive, be optimistic, be hopeful, and point to the good things, and let's us in the open source space make things that are attractive. So one of the interesting things that gets attraction with the megaphone is actually the fact that it boots in 2 seconds. That a phone that you don't have to wait 3 minutes to reboot. You're like, oh, that's really nice and interesting. And that it can have a much longer battery life, because we can actually put a battery in that we're not quite so cost sensitive about, because we're not trying to make something which is the cheapest phone out there. So I think you can find these kind of opportunities to provide that positive angle, and I think that's always the best that we can and ought to be looking to do as the open source community.
It's great. We still have 5 minutes for questions. Oh, here we have another one. But yes, we probably have time for another question or two after this, so keep typing them in, everyone. Question. Open source has been popular in more disadvantaged areas of the world. Do you see uptake from heavily populated parts of the world with difficult governments as a thing that may route around restrictions by corporations or their own governments, poor parts of Spain and South America, areas in Asia, India, etc.?
Okay, so one of the really interesting things that we experienced with the Serval project over time is that when we had it on the Google Play Store, we actually need to get it back up there. If there's an Android developer who'd like to help us with that, we'd welcome that contribution. But the install stats would actually show us where things were going wrong around the world. We would see a burst of installs somewhere, and then we would hear a few days later about developing political or other issues in places. So I think we actually already see this, and the challenge with the digital winter is we can get to the point where it's no longer possible for people to do that if this is happening in a widespread enough or an effective enough manner with internet filtering, for example. And so it's all a bit of a continuum, right? So we do what we can now for now and going forward. And in this kind of digital autumn, it's possible, and indeed it will happen, that people can kind of get recruited to being aware that this is an issue and start doing what they can, whether that's promoting these things in their communities or whether it's contributing to the technologies, or both.
The next question, which I'm sure is a challenging one. Do you have any good and memorable ideas to answer the unfortunately still very persistent and widespread argument, why should anyone care about my data?
I think you can just point to America and say, doesn't matter which side of the political divide that you might even fall in that, because I think we need to be transcendent of party politics completely. But that what's clear is that the breakdown in civil society has actually come about because of the formation of these echo chambers. And the echo chambers come about only because of the deep mining of the data of how people use the social media and that kind of thing. The use of our data is being applied to profit companies in return for dividing us against one another. So even aside from all of the other, creepy ads and that kind of thing, that the fabric of our society is being torn apart by separating us into these echo chambers as a result of the use of our data.
That leads into the next question. What sort of things could we do digitally that would make us, for example, Australia, I think that, I'm not quite sure what that word is meant to be, but safe?
Okay, so again, thinking about the different kind of threats, I think in Australia that we have natural disaster as a threat, and that we need technology that can respond to that. But also I think we need to encourage people to hold our government more to account, because I think they get a bit of a free ride at times, and particularly, as I say, for me as a personal concern, is Peter Dutton adding new powers to ASIO. Now, it doesn't matter whether that he's Liberal or Labor, I don't care about that, but the fact that these powers are being added without effective oversight and without grandfathering, even though they're responding to temporary issues, that makes me worried. So just getting the word out, and just making sure that we have the means to communicate and to share when governments are doing stupid things, to be able to share our displeasure, communicate that back to politicians as well, so that they know that people care. I think these sorts of things would be quite helpful. I think we have a lot of space in Australia to have some good technical innovations that support the strength of democracy while it's still quite strong. So, ways to remind people that actually, preferential voting means you don't have to vote for one of the two big parties first. All of these sorts of things. Or, having I'd love to see a website that let people collectively say how they think the federal budget should be spent, and then show in aggregate how people's decisions would actually look, and talk about how, this is all a compromise situation with everyone's needs wanting to be met. I might not want to fund something, but you might not want to fund something that I care about. But overall, we're actually all getting mostly what we're after, so that people have a better understanding of, of what democracy is, so that they don't end up as divided.
Unfortunately, everyone, I think we've run out of time for more questions, even though there are more questions coming in. So, Paul, are you available to head over to the other text chat channel?
I don't think I've got it set up. So the easiest way to find me, if you go to mega65.org, navbar, Discord server link, and I'll be on the general chat channel there. And I'll try and find my way onto the linux.conf one after as well.
I'll give you instructions once we cut to afternoon tea, Paul.
Sure.
So those of you who still have more questions for Paul, head on over to Invenulus with the sidebar. If you haven't found the Tux Theater post-talk Q&A channel, check the Browse More Channels button. And we'll send Paul over that way shortly. It's afternoon tea time now, so enjoy, have a nice break, drink some water. It's hot in Australia today, and we'll see you back at 3:45 conference time.
See you.